Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Warren Harding, and the focus is Alaska and untimely death. The year is 1923. We're about halfway through. The Harding administration had been productive but challenging. The Republicans lost badly in the recent midterms, still had a majority but much smaller. The First Lady, Florence Harding, was still trying to recover from a kidney ailment which had kicked up again in the fall of 22. Harding himself was sick. He had flu-like symptoms, an intestinal disorder. He called it the grip, so he wasn't feeling all that well himself. And so maybe as a bit of a pick-me-up, the Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, decided kind of on his own to announce that Harding was going to run for a second term, and he would win that job as a second term as President of the United States. Now, the Hardings were on vacation when this came out in the press. Kind of some surprise by Harding that the announcement came out, but he didn't backtrack, seemed fully committed to making that another run. Now, Harding was ever optimistic, but he was still down a bit. Still difficulty from, as we talked about in the last episode, the corruption in the Veterans Bureau and his friend Charles Forbes, somebody who he had trusted. And Forbes was just one of several friends that Harding had placed into office, but there were also a number of so-called cronies that came to Washington even without official jobs. Many of them hung out at a house on K Street. It became known as the Little Greenhouse. What happened there? A lot of card playing, a lot of drinking, and apparently a lot of influence peddling, where you buy access through these people to members of the administration. Well, one of the leaders at the Little Greenhouse was Jess Smith. Jess Smith was very close to Harry Daugherty. In fact, he had an office at the Justice Department. Even though he had no official job there, he was often there. He lived with Daugherty, helped Daugherty take care of his ill wife. He also managed Harry Daugherty's personal papers, kind of his unofficial personal aide, and everybody liked Jess Smith. He was happy-go-lucky. He loved to play golf. The Hardings enjoyed his company and was often included in a lot of trips, a lot of their gatherings. But there were also, again, these rumors about what's happening at the Little Greenhouse. And the question was it just a little wild play, or was this the headquarters of a criminal enterprise? And again, a lot of differences of opinions, and of course a lot of the suspicion was also about Harry Daugherty, the Attorney General. To what degree was he involved in this through his relationship with Jess Smith? Well, in 1923, those rumors got heated a bit, and Warren Harding was planning his big trip to Alaska, with Congress finally going into recess. Congress had been in session basically nonstop for the first 2 years of the Harding administration. They were about to go home. He was going to go on this big trip, and Harding told Harry Daugherty to keep Jess Smith off the trip. He was not going to be welcome to come, even though he was originally scheduled to. And Harry Daugherty wanted to know, well, why? Well, there were different stories in terms of sort of what was going on with Jess Smith. According to Daugherty, the president told him that Smith was simply partying too much. Hanging out with a gay crowd is what he said. Perhaps it was time for Jess Smith to go home, back to Ohio, and again, he's not coming on this trip. We got a little bit of a different story from the Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover. A number of years later, Hoover wrote in his memoirs about his days in the Harding administration that on the trip to Alaska, Harding had confided to him, and he said that Harding had followed the matter up and finally sent for Smith. After a painful session, he told Smith that he would be arrested in the morning. Smith went home, burned all his papers. He also burned Daugherty's papers and committed suicide. Harding gave me no information about what Smith had been up to, and in fact, when Hoover also pressed to say, well, is Daugherty involved in this? The president clammed up and never brought the topic up again. But it did appear, at least according to Hoover, that Smith was in trouble with the law and he was about to be arrested. There were a lot of questions going on with this suicide. What's going on in the Harding administration? And these were questions that would persist well after Harding himself passed from the scene. Well, Harding missed home as well. He was often thinking about Marion, Ohio, and his Marion Daily Star. In fact, every day, he said, every day at 3:30, here in the midst of affairs of state, I go to press on the Marion Star. I wonder what kind of layout the boys have got on the first page. I wonder how much advertising there is. I like to walk out in the composing room and look over the forms before they go to the stereotyper. There was never a day in all the years I ran the paper that I did not get some thrill out of it. So it came as a surprise that President Warren Harding finally decided to sell the Marion Daily Star. Now, he had plenty of offers before. Why did he sell this time? Well, first of all, the offer was pretty good. $550,000 coming from Louis Brush and Roy Moore. That's off a $300 initial investment way back when. Some people actually thought this was excessive, maybe something nefarious going on behind the scenes, almost a bribe, but that didn't seem to be the case. The paper was making about $60,000 a year. They had 11,000 subscribers, up from about 500 when he first started running the paper, and Harding agreed to write a column for the paper in his post-presidential years, creating even more value. So it seemed like a reasonable deal, and Harding finally decided to sell. Was he thinking about retirement? Yes, he was, because he also bought the family plot, the original family plot in Blooming Grove, Ohio, where he was born and spent the first 8 years of his life. He bought 266 acres. That was going to be his retirement community. In fact, he was thinking about building a 9-hole golf course on this property. Well, these were all his thoughts just before going on his big trip to Alaska. He said, you know what, economic change is going on in my world. Let's redo my will. So he had Harry Daugherty, who had been, of course, a lawyer in his own personal capacity prior to becoming Attorney General. He said, well, let's update my will. Daugherty helped out with that, and they put it off to the side and forgot all about it as the trip finally got underway. Now, no president had ever been to Alaska before, the territory that the U.S. had acquired back in 1867. This was 300 million acres with vast natural resources. Only 55,000 people lived in Alaska, and the federal presence, you had a governor, a federal judge, a U.S. Marshal, and a U.S. attorney. Several cabinet agencies had different equities in overseeing different territories in the United States, including Alaska, and the president wanted to see things for himself. Bring some of those cabinet secretaries with him, meet the people, let them see their president. He was looking forward to getting away from Washington and into this area where he could mingle with the people of Alaska. Well, the entourage finally got on its way in this voyage of discovery, as Harding called it. It's June of 1923. They made several stops on the way before getting to Alaska. Speeches, some from the back of a train, some from large halls, and one in St. Louis was a radio broadcast to the entire country, and this was a fairly serious address. He was continuing his consistent portrayal that the United States is not joining the League of Nations, but he was interested in joining the newly established World Court. Harding believed in international arbitration, independent arbitration to help settle international disputes. And in terms of this World Court, he was all in. He said in St. Louis, "I shall not restrict my appeal to your reason. I shall call upon your patriotism. I shall beseech your humanity. I shall reach to the very depths of love for your fellow countrymen of whatever race or creed throughout the world. My soul yearns for peace. My heart is anguished by the sufferings of war. My spirit is eager to serve. My passion is for justice over force. My hope is in the great court. My mind is made up. My resolution is fixed." Congress was not sold on this yet, but Harding kept talking about it. In fact, on several of his speeches on the trip to Alaska, he would talk about his interest in joining the World Court, perhaps something that he would push when he came back from this trip to Alaska. More stops, more speeches. The topics range from agriculture to labor to prohibition, even conservation, mostly typical pro-American patriotism, classic speeches from Warren Harding. The one person who was most concerned about all of this was Dr. Charles Sawyer, the White House physician who thought Harding was pushing too hard. He wanted him to slow down. Not all of these speeches from the back of the train in this boiling hot sun. His president needed rest, but Harding didn't want to let the people down. He pretty much kept going, exhausting himself, but still giving out these speeches. From Tacoma, Washington, that was the demarcation point to go to Alaska on the USS Henderson, this last 1,000 miles of the journey. Harding excited about this part of the trip. He said that what we want, boys, is to understand the actual situation in Alaska now. Keep your eyes and ears open. Get acquainted with the people. Tell the folks back home what the real Alaska of today is like. On his first stop, he met the governor of Alaska, Scott Boone. Met about 500 native-born Alaskans in this first stop, raised an American flag, very impressed with the 4-foot salmon coming out of the streams of Alaska. The next stop was Ketchikan, where the Harding celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. Truly enjoying these stops, what he said in Wrangell, Alaska, where he said, "You know, I do enjoy meeting these people. they help me more than I can tell them. They have preserved the sturdy spirit of the pioneer, and without our pioneers and frontiers, we are likely to lose the self-reliance and upstanding courage which have made our nation grow. He was learning about the people. He was learning about the crops, the industry, the beauty, the natural resources, and the opportunity that Alaska presented, not only for Alaskans, but for the rest of his country. Next stop was in Seward, Alaska. Then the train took him to Anchorage. Anchorage, a brand new town, just about 9 years since it had started construction, and the federal government had recently built the Alaska Central Railway. Nearly 500 miles of track, opening things up to the Yukon. When they arrived in Anchorage, it was 11 o'clock at night. The sun was still shining brightly, kind of unique to Alaska and the American sphere. Glimpse of Mount McKinley, the tallest point in the Western Hemisphere, over 20,000 feet, and also the Mount McKinley National Park, 3,000 square miles, the largest national park in the country, an untouched wild game preserve, part of the beauty of Alaska. Off to Fairbanks, where Harding met with the first graduating class of the Agricultural and Mining College there in Fairbanks. He stopped by the local paper, set some type, showed that he was still a pro at being a newsman. Speeches galore every stop along the way. Doc Sawyer was nervous, slow down. But even after he gave his speeches, it still wouldn't slow down for Harding, because he would play cards with his entourage until way into the wee hours of the morning. There was simply no rest for Harding on this trip. The last stop in Alaska was Sitka. This was the ancient Russian capital of Alaska. Then it was to Vancouver, where he became the first sitting president of the United States to speak on Canadian soil. Then back to the United States and U.S. soil in Seattle. Spoke to 60,000 people at Seattle Stadium against scorching hot sun. And after this one, he was clearly not well. Doctors were called in. In fact, they canceled the rest of his speeches. He finally agreed. The doctors were worried, put him on that train straight to San Francisco. He arrived. He went to the Palace Hotel, where he was due to have complete rest to try to recover. Some cardiac specialists were called in. Thought it might be a problem with Harding's heart. Joel Boone, Charles Cooper were the two of the doctors, along with Ray Wilbur. Wilbur was the president of nearby Stanford University and a future president of the American Medical Association. So a bunch of experts who were closely monitoring the president's condition, and it seemed like by August 1st, he was finally starting to improve. Doc Sawyer gave the news that the crisis had passed, and of course he had spoken too soon. The very next day, the First Lady is reading to her husband out of the Saturday Evening Post an article called A Calm View of a Calm Man. And then Florence Harding told Harry Daugherty later, this is what happened. He seemed so well and so cheerful this evening that I began to read it again to him. I stopped for a moment, thinking he had fallen asleep, when he looked at me and said, "That's good. Read some more." I turned to the page, and as I did, he threw his right arm over his head. I saw his face twitch. I leaped to my feet, bent over him. He was dead. It all happened in a second. The nation was in shock. Millions would line the tracks after they removed the body from the Palace Hotel, put it back on the train. Again, millions of mourners lining the tracks, sad over the loss of their president. Calvin Coolidge, the new president, was sworn into office, and he met that train at Union Station in Washington, D.C., as some of the eulogies started to appear in print. One of the first in the Marion Daily Star. George Van Vliet wrote this himself: "President Harding is dead." This brief message flashed around the globe, brought sorrow to the nation, and touched the tenderest sympathies of the liberty-loving people of every land. But here in Marion, where we knew and loved him as Harding the man, Harding the fellow citizen, Harding the neighbor, and Harding the friend, rather than Harding the president, the blackest grief obtains. Warren Harding's body went to the White House before it was then taken on a long procession, a slow-moving procession to the Capitol, where his body lay in state. There was a public viewing as thousands came by before they took the body out of the Capitol, put it back on the train, heading back to Marion. When it got there, they actually brought it to Harding's father's home, Tyron's home, where again some locals were allowed a visitation before the next day Harding was buried, his initial burial in Marion Cemetery. This was an abrupt, sad ending to a popular president that had suddenly gone from the scene. Again, eulogies came in. We'll quote just one other. Charles Evans Hughes, was the Secretary of State, and he said he was a man of the people, indulging no consciousness of superiority and capable of arrogance. Nothing human was alien to him, and he had the divine gift of sympathy, said Hughes. He wrought mightily for the prosperity of the nation and for the peace of the world, but he clothed the exercise of power with the beautiful garments of gentleness. He gave his life for his country. No one can do more than that. He exhausted himself in service, a martyr in fidelity to the interests of the people for whom he labored with a passionate devotion, said Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. But this is not really the president, Warren Harding, that most of history has remembered. Very different president, because right after he died, just a couple of weeks later, that's when the stories started to come out. The scandals, the mistresses. We'll cover those as stories for another day. For now, that is Alaska, an untimely death from the life of Warren Harding. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.